Now that I've got everything drawn out, my foreground, my background, my border, I'm ready to watercolor. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get my watercolor palette and I'm going to make my paint. So right now I have concentrated color. And in order to make paint, I'm going to move my paper out of the way for a minute. In order to make paint, what I want to do is I want to drop some water into each color that I'm going to use. So I'm just dropping a little bit of water into these colors, just clean water. And I'm actually probably going to use all of my colors today, except for black. There's some brown, and the brown in this palette tends to look gray, so I may not end up using that either. But what we paint with when we do watercolor is actually the water. It's colored water. It's not the paint or the concentrate that's in this palette. It's the water. So what I'm doing is I'm putting water onto the concentrate, and I'm going to let that pull up paint. And so it's going to pull up the paint, and then the water that I put in there becomes what I paint with. That's the watercolor. So if you think about a box of cereal or a bag of chips or something like that that has ingredients on the side, the ingredient that's listed first is what there's most of. So when we think about that, watercolor is mostly water. So I'm going to let that sit for a second. For my black and my white, I'm going to use the paint that we used in an earlier project, which was either acrylic or tempera. Either one will work. I'm going to water these down significantly when I do use them. The white, if you have white in your painting, and that is going to be the paper. The actual paper is the white. So we don't put white on top. We leave it blank. We leave those spaces blank. Okay, so the other thing, I'm going to let that sit for a minute and get my painting back out and zoom out. Okay, the other thing is that I want to look at my photograph while I do this. So I'm going to, it's in Schoology and it's under Taken Creatures, and I'm going to find mine. And there it is. Okay, I'm going to start with background. So as you can see, my background is very blurry. But I want to try to follow those colors a little bit at least. So I'm going to pull my colors back out now that they've had a chance to soak up the color. So I'm using the water, and there's a lot of green and some pink and some blue. So I'm actually going to start with my blue, and all I'm doing is barely touching that water and letting my brush suck up some of that water. And so I can test on a piece of test paper the color that I get. And I like that. That's a good color. So I'm only painting inside this border. Only inside this border is where my background is going. And so there's a little bit of blue right in here. And then a little bit right over here. And then it kind of turns into a green. So I'm going to pick up some of my green. This is not quite dark enough for me. So I'm actually going to use some of the water and pull it against the side of the well to get a darker color. I'm not scraping. I'm not pushing my brush down into it. I'm just rubbing the water over it to try and get a little bit of a darker color. And that's what I want. Okay. So this is going to go into a green. And again, I'm keeping all of my background color inside of my border. So this starts to come in. And then it gets a little darker over here. So I'm going to pull just a little of this black, but I'm making sure I've got plenty of water in my brush. A lot more black than I wanted, but that's okay. And so we don't layer opaquely. So if I put the color down, I can change the color just a little bit with watercolor, but it's not like a regular acrylic or like a wall paint. We don't paint over and over and over. As I move on, I'm going to pick up a little of the red. So there is a little of the red in the background. And it's just a blurry background. So my goal here is not no particular object, just some background color. And I'm going to kind of let it fade out and fade back in as I move from one color to another. So where my two colors meet, I'm going to put some clean water on my brush and fade them out together. And so all I'm doing is adding in my colors. And again, where I want things to fade in and out, I can add in some water to blend the two. Or I can blend them as is, like I'm doing with the blue and the green right now. Thought the blue was too blue, so I put a little green in it. Brushes. You don't want to scrub too much on this paper. I like to wiggle my paintbrush around, but I have to remind myself, being that it's poster board, that it needs to be more of a smooth stroke. As you can see, I went over the line right there. Not a problem. We will fix that in the next part. And so all I'm going to do is continue and finish this background. Okay, now that I have my background painted, it's time to start painting on my foreground. So the only thing that's going to be in color is going to be inside the box, except for the objects that come out of the box that are my creature. So for instance, this stick or limb comes out of the box, but the only part that is going to be color is going to be what's in the box, because it is not part of my creature. So I'm going to put a little bit of color in it, and I'm trying to keep in mind where that border is, which is the whole reason I'm starting with this area, so that I can remind myself to stay in the box. The same thing's going to happen here. So I have this tree limb that's going to have color, but I'm trying to stay inside the box. And I want it to have a little texture. I want to leave a highlight. So I'm going to use white, the white of my paper, not white paint, but the white of my paper for the highlight. And then opposite the highlight, I'll use some of the black to make a little bit of darkness, to make it look a little more three-dimensional, and to put some of that texture back in. Okay. And so everything I do, when I do this branch over here, it's only going to be the parts that are inside the box, except for my actual birds or my creatures. And that is step 6.